They thought destroying my garden and car would break me. They had no idea they'd just picked a fight with someone who spent 15 years taking down white-collar criminals. This story made local headlines, but here you'll hear everything they tried to cover up. What would you have done if you were me? Let me know in the comments. I should probably start by telling you who I am. My name is Michael Torres, and at 52 years old, I thought I had left the world of criminal investigations behind me forever. After 15 years as an FBI financial crimes investigator, I decided to take early retirement and enjoy the quiet life. Looking back, that was probably my first mistake. I should have known that nowhere is truly peaceful when you're dealing with people who think they can control everyone around them through intimidation and manipulation. But at the time, all I wanted was a peaceful place where I could finally relax without constantly chasing money launderers and corporate fraudsters through endless paper trails and courtroom battles. Willowbrook seemed perfect when I first drove through it. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, the kind of neighborhood where you'd expect friendly neighbors and maybe the occasional community barbecue. I bought a beautiful craftsman-style house on Cedar Lane. Nothing too flashy, but comfortable enough for someone who just wanted to restore classic cars in his garage and grow tomatoes in his backyard. The realtor mentioned something about a homeowners association, but honestly, I wasn't paying much attention. I figured it was just one of those standard organizations that make sure people maintain their properties and don't leave junk cars on their lawns. How wrong I was about that assumption. The first few weeks were exactly what I had hoped for. I set up my workshop in the garage, started restoring a 1967 Mustang I had bought at auction, and planted a vegetable garden in the backyard because I had always wanted to grow my own food. My neighbors seemed normal enough. There was Jennifer Walsh next door, a freelance graphic designer who worked from home, and David Kim across the street, retired accountant who was always working on some home improvement project. Normal people living normal lives. I actually started thinking I had made the right choice moving to Willowbrook. Then Patricia Hoffman showed up at my door with her clipboard and attitude. I remember it was a Thursday morning around 10 o'clock, and I was in my garage working on the Mustang when this woman came marching up my driveway like she owned the entire neighborhood. Patricia Hoffman, dressed in a business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, storming toward my garage like she had some kind of authority over me. She introduced herself as the president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association and immediately started lecturing me about compliance issues and community standards. The way she carried herself, you'd think she was the mayor of the entire city. "Mr. Torres," she said without any pleasantries or introduction, "I need you to sign these documents to officially join our Homeowners Association. The annual fee is $2,800, and there are several violations we need to address immediately." She shoved the papers at me like I was supposed to be grateful for her attention. Something about her tone immediately rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she assumed I would just comply without asking questions. Or maybe it was how she was already talking about violations when I had been living there for less than 3 weeks. Either way, I could feel my investigator instincts kicking in automatically. I took the papers and started reading through them carefully, which seemed to annoy Patricia because she kept tapping her foot impatiently while I reviewed the documents. What I saw made my blood pressure rise immediately. These weren't reasonable community guidelines designed to maintain property values. These were control mechanisms designed to micromanage every aspect of how people lived in their own homes. Vehicle storage required written approval, even in your own garage. Garden plants had to be selected from a pre-approved list of species. Even the color of outdoor furniture was regulated down to specific paint codes that had to be verified annually. The whole thing read like something designed by someone with serious control issues. I looked up at Patricia, who was standing there with this entitled expression, like she had just handed me the opportunity of a lifetime. "I'm not signing this," I said simply, not because I don't understand property law, but because I don't want to be controlled by someone who clearly has boundary issues. The look on her face was absolutely priceless. It was like no one had ever refused her demands before in her entire life. Her perfectly composed business expression cracked for just a moment, and I saw something nasty underneath, something that told me this woman was used to getting her way through intimidation, and she didn't appreciate being challenged by someone who wasn't afraid of her. Threats. Patricia's voice immediately became cold and threatening. You'll regret this decision, Mr. Torres. This community has standards, and we don't tolerate people who think they're above the rules that everyone else follows. The way she emphasized the word everyone had this weird undertone to it, like there was some hidden meaning I was supposed to understand. I handed the papers back to her and told her to have a pleasant day, thinking that would be the end of our interaction. If only I had known what kind of vindictive campaign I was about to face. Just 3 days later, I found a citation notice taped to my front door. $500 for unauthorized vehicle storage because my Mustang project car was visible through the garage window. I actually had to laugh when I read it, because my garage door had been open while I was working, just like half the other garages in the neighborhood where people were doing their own projects. But apparently, my classic car restoration somehow violated their community standards in a way that everyone else's activities didn't. Standing there on my front porch reading that ridiculous citation, I realized this wasn't going to be a simple disagreement about HOA membership. Patricia Hoffman had just declared war on someone she knew absolutely nothing about. But as I watched her walking away from my property with that clipboard swinging, I knew this was just the beginning of whatever vindictive campaign she had planned. Patricia didn't waste any time showing me exactly what kind of person I was dealing with over the next 2 weeks. Citation notices started appearing under my door regularly. Lawn height violation for $300, because my grass was apparently 1/4 inch too tall, according to their measurements. Garden violation for $400 because I had planted tomatoes instead of the approved decorative plants from their official list at vehicle. Noise violation for $250 because I had started my car at 7:15 in the morning, which was apparently 15 minutes before their noise ordinance allowed. The absurdity of these citations was mind-boggling, but what really concerned me was the pattern I was beginning to see. These weren't random harassment tactics. This was a systematic campaign designed to escalate financial pressure until I either joined the HOA or moved away from the neighborhood. That's when my FBI training really kicked in, because systematic harassment campaigns always have financial motivations behind them, instead of getting angry and fighting each citation individually, which is what most people would do. I decided to step back and analyze the bigger picture like I would any other financial crimes investigation. I spent an entire weekend researching the Willowbrook HOA, their financial records, their incorporation documents, and their procedural history. What I discovered was fascinating and deeply disturbing. Patricia Hoffman had been systematically targeting non-member homeowners for years, using citation harassment to force people into joining the association or selling their properties to buyers she pre-approved. But the really interesting part came when I started following the money trail, which is something you learn to do automatically after 15 years of financial crimes investigation. The HOA's annual budget showed some unusual patterns. Large consulting fees paid to companies that didn't seem to exist. Property maintenance contracts with businesses that had no legitimate addresses. Legal fees that were completely disproportionate to the services supposedly provided. This wasn't just about HOA membership or community standards. Patricia was running some kind of financial scheme using the Homeowners Association as a front for money laundering or embezzlement. That's when Jennifer Walsh knocked on my door with information that confirmed my suspicions. Jennifer was a graphic designer, but she was also naturally curious about the neighborhood dynamics because she worked from home and noticed everything that happened around here. She had been keeping informal records of Patricia's activities for months because something about the HOA president's behavior had always seemed suspicious to her. "Michael," she said, "I've been watching Patricia's pattern with new homeowners, and I think you should know what I've discovered. She targets people who refuse to join the HOA with escalating harassment until they either comply or move away. But here's the interesting part. Every house that gets sold because of her pressure campaign ends up being purchased by the same real estate investment company. That got my attention immediately because coordinated harassment campaigns designed to manipulate property sales are federal crimes under multiple statutes. Jennifer continued with more details that made the pattern even clearer. The investment company that buys these properties is owned by Patricia's brother-in-law. They buy houses below market value from people who are desperate to escape the HOA harassment, then sell them at full market price to buyers who are pre-screened to join the association. David Kim joined our conversation and provided even more pieces of the puzzle. David was a retired accountant with 40 years of experience in financial analysis, and he had been quietly investigating the HOA's books for months because their published budgets didn't make mathematical sense. "The numbers don't add up," he said, showing me spreadsheets he had compiled from public records. "The HOA is collecting far more in fees and citations than they're spending on legitimate community services. The excess money is being funneled through shell companies that all trace back to businesses owned by Patricia or her family members." I decided to dig deeper into Patricia's background and financial history using resources that most people don't have access to, but former FBI agents can still utilize through professional contacts. What I found was a pattern of similar schemes in 3 other communities where Patricia had previously served as HOA president before moving to Willowbrook. In each location, she had used the same systematic harassment tactics to pressure homeowners into compliance or force property sales to affiliated investment companies. But in 2 of those communities, residents had eventually filed complaints with state authorities, which is why Patricia had moved her operation to Colorado, where the regulatory oversight was less stringent. The scope of this scheme was much larger than just neighborhood harassment. Patricia was running a coordinated real estate manipulation operation that had probably generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits over the past several years. This was exactly the kind of white-collar crime I had spent my career investigating and prosecuting. That's when things took a much more serious turn. I was working in my garage one evening when I heard glass breaking in my driveway. Someone had thrown a brick through the windshield of my Mustang project car and left a note that said, "Join the HOA or face the consequences of your stubbornness." The vandalism itself wasn't particularly sophisticated, but the timing was concerning because it represented an escalation from financial harassment to actual property destruction. I photographed everything, collected the evidence, and started building what I knew would eventually become a federal case file. The next morning, I discovered that someone had destroyed my entire vegetable garden overnight. Every plant had been uprooted, the irrigation system had been damaged, and someone had poured salt into the soil to prevent anything from growing there again. The level of vindictiveness was breathtaking, but it was also extremely stupid because property destruction leaves forensic evidence that trained investigators know how to collect and analyze. I spent the morning documenting everything with photographs, soil samples, and measurements while my neighbors gathered to see what had happened. The community response was interesting because several people mentioned that similar incidents had happened to other homeowners who had refused to join the HOA over the past 2 years. Jennifer showed me security camera footage from her home system that captured 2 people destroying my garden at 3 in the morning. The video quality wasn't perfect because it was dark, but it was clear enough to see that one of the vandals was wearing clothing identical to what Patricia had been wearing earlier that day when she dropped off. Another citation notice. David provided financial analysis showing that the cost of repairing my garden and car would exceed $5,000, which elevated these incidents from misdemeanor vandalism to felony property destruction charges. But more importantly, the systematic nature of these attacks created a pattern that could support federal harassment and conspiracy charges. That evening, I was reviewing all the evidence I had collected when my phone rang. It was someone I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Agent Lisa Rodriguez from the Denver FBI field office, someone I had worked with on dozens of financial crimes cases during my career. I hadn't contacted her yet, but apparently, word had gotten around about a retired agent dealing with some unusual neighborhood problems. "Michael," she said, "I heard through the grapevine that you might be dealing with some interesting white-collar crime issues in your retirement. Want to have a conversation about it?" The FBI grapevine is remarkably efficient when it comes to cases that might involve former agents, especially when those cases fall into areas of federal jurisdiction. I told Lisa about Patricia's systematic harassment campaign, the financial irregularities in the HOA budget, the coordinated property manipulation scheme, and the recent escalation to actual vandalism and threats. Her response was exactly what I had hoped for as a former investigator. Michael, what you're describing sounds like a RICO case waiting to happen. Real estate manipulation, money laundering, systematic harassment, and now property destruction. We should probably have a formal conversation about this before it escalates any further. Within 48 hours, my quiet retirement home had been transformed into the command center for a federal financial crimes investigation. Lisa had arrived with a full forensic accounting team and enough equipment to conduct a comprehensive analysis of Patricia's entire operation. Agent Sarah Chen, who specialized in real estate fraud cases, spread my evidence across my dining room table, like she was assembling pieces of a complex puzzle. Michael, she said, this is some of the most thorough documentation we've ever received from a civilian complainant. You've basically built our entire case file for us, complete with financial analysis and witness statements. The FBI team was particularly interested in the connection between Patricia's HOA harassment campaigns and the real estate investment company owned by her brother-in-law. Agent Chen pulled up corporate records that showed the investment company had purchased 17 properties in Willowbrook over the past 3 years, all from homeowners who had been targeted by Patricia's citation harassment. But the really damaging evidence came from Patricia's personal financial records, which the FBI obtained through federal subpoenas. Her bank accounts showed regular deposits from the HOA accounts that far exceeded any legitimate salary or reimbursements. She had been embezzling association funds for years while using the harassment campaigns to generate additional revenue through forced property sales. The scope of the scheme was even larger than I had initially suspected. Patricia hadn't just been targeting individual homeowners for harassment. She had been manipulating the entire real estate market in Willowbrook to benefit her family's investment company while stealing money from the Homeowners Association to fund her personal lifestyle. Lisa coordinated with federal prosecutors to execute search warrants on Patricia's home, the HOA offices, and the investment company offices simultaneously. I wasn't allowed to participate in the searches, obviously, but Lisa called me with updates throughout the day as they uncovered more evidence of the conspiracy. At Patricia's home computer contained detailed spreadsheets tracking her harassment campaigns against specific homeowners, including timelines for escalating pressure tactics and projected dates for forced property sales. Her email correspondence with the investment company showed clear coordination between the harassment campaigns and property acquisition strategies, but the real smoking gun came from the HOA's financial records. The FBI found evidence of systematic embezzlement totaling over $400,000 over the past 5 years. Patricia had been using multiple shell companies to funnel HOA funds into personal accounts while falsifying the association's financial reports to hide the theft from member homeowners. The federal prosecutors were particularly interested in the interstate aspects of the case because Patricia had used similar schemes in multiple states, which elevated everything to federal jurisdiction under the wire fraud and racketeering statutes. This wasn't just local corruption anymore. This was organized financial crime that crossed state boundaries. 3 days after the search warrants were executed, Lisa called me with the news I had been expecting. Michael, we've got her. Patricia Hoffman is being arrested this morning on federal charges including mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and civil rights violations under the federal housing discrimination statutes. I asked Lisa about the civil rights charges, and she explained that the FBI had found evidence suggesting Patricia had been systematically targeting homeowners based on their perceived ability to fight back against her harassment campaigns. The targeting of elderly residents and single-parent households qualified as housing discrimination under federal civil rights laws. The arrests made local news immediately, and the community response was fascinating to watch. Several neighbors who had been quietly intimidated by Patricia for years suddenly came forward with their own stories of harassment and financial manipulation. The scope of her operation had affected far more people than anyone had realized. Jennifer wrote an article about the case for a local magazine that specialized in consumer protection issues, and the story was picked up by national real estate publications as an example of HOA corruption and abuse of power. The case became a cautionary tale about the importance of financial oversight in community associations. The preliminary hearing was unlike anything I had experienced as a civilian witness, even though I had testified in hundreds of similar cases as an FBI agent. Patricia had hired expensive defense attorneys, but they were struggling with the mountain of financial evidence against their client. Patricia herself looked completely different from the confident HOA president who had showed up at my door months earlier. Gone was the perfectly styled business attire and authoritative demeanor. Instead, she sat at the defendant's table looking pale and defeated, like someone finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had gotten herself into. The prosecution methodically presented evidence of Patricia's escalating criminal behavior over the past 5 years. Agent Chen walked the court through the financial analysis showing systematic embezzlement from HOA accounts. Agent Rodriguez presented the real estate manipulation scheme that had, generated hundreds of thousands in illegal profits. Jennifer's testimony about the harassment campaigns was particularly effective because she had documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. When she presented the security footage of my garden being destroyed, several people in the courtroom visibly reacted to what they were seeing. David's financial analysis sealed the case by showing exactly how Patricia had stolen money from homeowners while manipulating property sales to benefit her family's investment company. His 40 years of accounting experience showed in every detail of his testimony, and the defense attorneys couldn't find any flaws in his analysis. The moment that really broke Patricia's case came when the prosecution played recordings of her threatening phone calls to various homeowners. Thanks to Colorado's one-party consent laws, several residents had recorded Patricia's increasingly aggressive demands and threats over the years. You could see the exact moment Patricia realized her own words were going to convict her. Her face went completely white, and she grabbed her attorney's arm like she was trying to physically stop the recordings from playing in court. Her carefully constructed image as a professional community leader was crumbling in real time. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and damning. Patricia Hoffman was bound over for trial on all federal charges, including conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and civil rights violations. The judge's comments were particularly satisfying to hear. Ms. Hoffman, the evidence suggests a pattern of systematic criminal behavior that has caused substantial financial and emotional harm to numerous victims over multiple years. The court finds probable cause that you engaged in organized criminal activity under the guise of community leadership. Bail was set at $750,000, ensuring Patricia would remain in custody pending trial. The actual trial 6 months later was even more devastating for the defense. The prosecution had uncovered additional evidence of similar schemes in other states, establishing a clear pattern of organized criminal behavior. Patricia's brother-in-law had agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed testimony about how the real estate manipulation scheme had operated. His cooperation exposed the full scope of the conspiracy and implicated several other family members who had been involved in the money laundering operation. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia Hoffman was convicted of federal conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and civil rights violations. The sentencing hearing came 2 months later. Judge Williams' decision was both thorough and creative in addressing the multiple victims of Patricia's crimes. Patricia was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of over $800,000 to cover embezzled HOA funds, property damage, and emotional distress compensation for her victims. But the legal consequences were just the beginning of Patricia's downfall. The investigation had exposed massive corruption throughout her entire operation. The real estate investment company was shut down, and its assets were seized to pay victim restitution. Several family members received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years for their roles in the money laundering conspiracy. The Willowbrook Homeowners Association was completely restructured with new leadership and transparent financial oversight procedures. The restrictive covenants that Patricia had used to harass residents were voted out by unanimous agreement of the membership. Property values actually increased by 15% once the harassment campaigns ended and normal market conditions returned. The ripple effects extended far beyond our immediate community. The case attracted attention from state legislators, who introduced new laws requiring financial auditing and oversight for homeowners associations. Legal scholars began using Patricia's case as an example of how civil disputes can escalate into federal crimes when they involve systematic financial fraud. Standing in my restored garden 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, I often reflect on how completely she had underestimated her opponent. She had seen a quiet retiree who would be easy to intimidate and control through harassment and property destruction. Instead, she had picked a fight with someone who understood financial crimes better than she ever would. The investigation had been personally satisfying in a way that surprised me because I thought I was done with law enforcement work forever. But there was something deeply gratifying about using my investigative skills to protect my own community from organized criminal activity. Sometimes retirement doesn't mean you stop fighting for justice. It just means you get to choose your battles more carefully. Patricia's appeal was denied, and she's currently serving her sentence in federal prison while taking mandatory courses in ethics and financial responsibility. Several of her co-conspirators are also serving time, and the entire criminal network has been completely dismantled. The neighborhood looks completely different now. Children play freely in the streets without fear of HOA citations. Neighbors talk across fence lines without worrying about surveillance and harassment. People maintain their properties because they take pride in their homes, not because they're afraid of vindictive punishment from power-hungry association presidents. The transformation has been remarkable, and it's a constant reminder that sometimes you have to fight for the community you want to live in. Bullies and criminals rely on people being too intimidated or too isolated to fight back effectively. But when someone finally stands up to them with the right knowledge and resources, their entire operation can collapse surprisingly quickly. The moral of this story is simple but important. Never assume you know who you're dealing with until you understand exactly what their background and capabilities might be. Patricia Hoffman gambled everything on intimidation and financial manipulation, thinking she was dealing with just another suburban retiree who could be easily controlled. Instead, she had picked a fight with someone who had spent 15 years dismantling criminal organizations, much more sophisticated than her small-town harassment operation. She rolled the dice on systematic fraud and racketeering, and lost spectacularly when she targeted someone who understood exactly how to build a federal case against organized criminal activity. Sometimes justice really is served with interest, and it tastes exactly as satisfying as you'd expect it to. The quiet life I had been looking for turned out to be much more peaceful once the criminals were removed from the equation. And maybe that's the real lesson here about retirement from law enforcement. You never really stop being an investigator. You just get better at choosing which cases deserve your attention. If you're still watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about HOA abuse of power and how communities can protect themselves from this kind of systematic harassment. And if this story resonated with you, the super thanks button is right below this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.